Flexibility also allowed her to participate in many caving projects, but she may be better known for her spring break project, which we'll also hear. She continues to try and find ways to support the caving community and the NSS, having worked on the staff and volunteering for at least 25 conventions. She is now working on the Vertical Training Commission Curriculum Committee and is assistant to the chairs of the 2025 convention. She still runs Spelio books, trying to connect used books with people who need or want them. And she is also looking for the next opportunity to help where she can, because as she says, in the end, it is the rewards that come with volunteering that open so many doors. Many of you all may know what a nor'easter is. It's a storm. So all I can do is tell you, please hang on to your seats. And I'm pleased to introduce Emily Davis as our 2024 Luminary speaker. Thank you.
There we go. Why me? So when Gary asked me to be a Luminary speaker, I pretty much said, why me? I consider myself an average caver who just happens to have devoted a life to caving. I look at three things that have brought me to where I am today. One is opportunity. Life is a series of opportunities, and you can either sit in a chair and say, I could never do that, or you can get up and say, how can I do that? Second was volunteerism. The community gave so much to me, I've always felt I needed to give back. And last is the community. Although I love my brothers, this is my family. This is where I am. This is what I care about. All right, who is this cute child? We must have mixed up the photos. Now, there I am in 1951. My mother and father were fairly traditional, having family photos. I grew up in a household that was full of art, music, theater, and science. I went to high school at a Bohemian prep school where art, music, theater, and science were key. I also worked for a veterinarian for 4 years in high school and went off to do pre-veterinary medicine at the University of Denver.
Yeah.
In 1969, I arrived in Denver, and I went to my first University of Denver outing club meeting. There I met this really cute guy. And I'd never heard of caving. He was head of the caving group. I'd never heard of caving. I thought, well, he's really cute. And caving sounds interesting. And off I went on a caving trip with my friend Peter Jones. That weekend, I fell madly in love with caving. But Peter Jones, to this day, is one of my closest friends. 55 years of friendship from an outing club meeting. Off we went to the Guadalupe Mountains on my first trips. We learned vertical work. We rappelled off the side of the University of Denver Stadium. Of course, we never climbed back up. I never did my first descent until we were underground in Three Fingers Cave. And Peter handed me the gear and said, here, climb. We also did work at Glenwood Springs Caverns. This was a trip where we were bringing dynamite in to help work on the trails there. I had the blasting caps, and Carol had the dynamite. But everywhere we went, Peter was taking pictures. And I really enjoyed working as a photo slave, and this will come back to haunt me later on. On our first trip down there, we stayed in the garage of Andy Kaminsky, also known as the Mad Russian. And Thanksgiving dinner was over a Coleman stove in the middle of the garage. And then off we went to the mountains. Yeah, can we get some of these overheads off? Oh, great, thank you. There we go. Is that better?
Yes.
Okay. So at the end of that year, I realized that the veterinary career was not for me. Calculus eluded me, and that was the end of that. So I went back east and started caving in the crawly little mud holes in Vermont and New York. I started the Franklin Pierce College Outing Club and dragged people off to see caves, including Ball Cave. And we had great trips during the school year. So at the end of that first couple of years, that my life would revolve around caving. And in '71, I went to my first NSS convention. Met a bunch of cavers from New York and visited NSS conventions. I loved the camaraderie in the campgrounds and at conventions, and was lucky enough to be able to meet and spend time with NSS number 1 and 2, Merle and Bill Stevenson. I got to go into the Speleo Olympics and enjoy the Speleo Olympics with friends. The center guy is Ed Zalaki. He was president of the Boston Grotto at the time. And by '76, I had corralled my younger brother into going to an NSS convention in West Virginia with me. I made our banquet clothes out of old denim and quilted up the side of his leg. That was actually a snake that wound around and ended with its head on one cheek of his butt and an apple on the other cheek. I volunteered for the 1979 convention as treasurer and in charge of registration. In those days, you did double duty. And in those days, we had registration that started noon Saturday and didn't end until Monday without a break. So at some point during the night on Saturday night, I put up a sign that said, "Wake me to register," and went to sleep in front of the registration desk. I worked on my vertical skills and saw what I could do to improve them and then help teach others. So in '71, I was at Franklin Pierce College, and one of the professors was a biology professor, and he said, "Well, there are lots of caves in Puerto Rico. You should put together a Puerto Rico interim." We had a January interim class. And at the end of the NSS convention in '71, Russ Gurney had spoken, and he was talking about Puerto Rico, and I went up to him afterwards and said, "Well, I want to lead an expedition to Puerto Rico." At 21, I looked like I was 16, and Russ looked at me and said, "Well, they're awfully tough caves, but here are a couple of people you can contact." This was a common thing for Russ to do, I found out later. He would challenge you. He'd give you a small piece of information and then see if you went with it. Well, I went with it. And Russ had done a whole bunch of work in Puerto Rico. Very soon after, I had a team in Puerto Rico. Ed Zalaki, because he was over 25 and could sign the rental car paperwork. Friends from British Tortola, David and Shirley St. Pierre, who had not been caving together since they started having children, and we managed to get them underground by babysitting for them a couple of days, and 3 members of the Franklin Pierce College Outing Club group. It was tough caving. It was swimming with ropes and gear. It was trying to survey while floating with your life vest. It was lots of work. But we did manage to connect with that Siloom. We managed to connect Cueva de los Ángeles and Cueva del Humo, which Russ added to his book on discovery at the Rio Camoy. It was an exciting time. I came back to Puerto Rico many times. Some of those times were for NCRC classes. I went as a specialist, and I got to cave with Joe Ivy, who I miss to this day. We also did the NCRC classes in rivers where you had to learn how to float the stretchers. And I got to do pre and post trips into really beautiful caves like Juan Neves and Sorbetos. And I stayed connected to one of the men who helped me in 1972 do the expedition we did, Norm Veve, who stayed a friend until he passed away a few years ago. I also got very, very excited about caving in West Virginia. My first West Virginia trip was a Boston Grotto trip in the early 70s with Alan Boudreau, who also became my scuba diving instructor. I met Miles Drake, and Bruce Smith took Miles and me into hellhole one day, complete again with dynamite, to blow up some passage that he wanted to check out. It was a great trip. I didn't own my own vertical gear at the time. The 30-foot drop, lower drop, Bruce put me in a Texas, and I had a horrible time. And I got to the entrance and I said, oh my gosh, if he puts me in that again, I'm going to be in really big trouble. Luckily, he put me in a Mitchell, and I had no problem after that. I also met Dennis Regan, who was a Boston Grotto member. Dennis and I spent time caving in Cowshit Pit, which is now Maxwellton Sink, and asked Dennis some day about the time that he blew off his eyelashes and eyebrows in the crawlway. I love West Virginia, and I spent many years caving there, doing expeditions both in Cowshit Pit and then a lot of trips in Scott Hollow, where I carried tanks for John Swanee, did bolting trips with Paul Rubin and Carl Snyder, and really loved that cave, spent a lot of project time there. So, what am I going to do for a living? Love caving, have these degrees, bachelor's degree in creative and performing arts. At this point, I didn't have the master's degree, but I started working in professional theater. This is me with a job as a spotlight operator on a strip show. At the same time, in '73, Doug and Linda Rhodes were starting Speleo books. I didn't know that that would affect me, but it did. In '76, my younger brother Andy and I went to the '76 convention. You saw our cute outfits for the banquet. And I had one box of books. I had gone to used bookstores, and I had bought books that were under the prices that I'd seen them at convention, brought this one box of books, it's just sort of spread out on the table there, and sold them all. I made $100 profit. And I thought, oh my God, this is the way to go to convention. I bring old books and I get to go to convention for free. Well, I didn't know what I was looking forward to. That fall in '77, I met Bill Mobley. He was an antiquarian book and print dealer, and within a year we were married, and I established Emily Davis Mobley, Old and Rare, Cave and Back Books, Prints and Ephemera. Well, that wasn't going to last. The marriage did for 20 years, but the business didn't, because very soon after, I started teaching at Wilbraham and Munson Academy, finished my master's degree in communication arts, and right after that, at the school, coached a bicycle racing team, did theater work there, and then in '78, Doug and Linda decided to sell Speleo books, and since I was already selling used books, they decided to sell it to me. At which point, I changed the name of the business to Speleo Books. Boy, is that much easier to say. And we started producing catalogs. I started traveling to events, and my love of costumes and theater showed itself quite often. And at the end of 1996, I realized that I couldn't both run Speleo Books and teach. So I left my teaching job, bought this property in Schoharie, New York, right across the street from what was then known as Ball's Cave. 86. And purchased the property. So I taught for 10 years, then bought this property, including the Octagon Barn, which has become famous in caving lore. In '96, Bill Mobley decided he needed a change of life, moved west. Mike was working for me at the time and established Speleo books online and eventually weaseled his way into my heart. Well, it was pretty easy to do. The last catalogs we produced were 2001 because the website that Mike had set up was so popular and worked so well, we no longer needed printed catalogs. Now, I still do some interesting extra advertising. The website isn't all. I love to get costumes, and we have, these are the commercial floats at the Doodah Parade, and there is my costume buddy, Bob Addis. 40 years had passed quickly. It was amazing how quickly the time passed. We established lots and lots of friendships with vendors and had new products produced for us all over the place, things that nobody else had. And I was able to attract the caving community into buying all kinds of things from me. And we were able to make it a living. We brought the business to a wide range of places such as the Explorers Club, and last year celebrated 50 years of Speleo books since Doug and Linda established it. We were able to celebrate the 50 years with Rick Stanton and Karen, and we really have gotten very good at setting up these professional, really nice-looking stores that are put up in 7 to 8 hours. But why did I do all this? I did this so I could take opportunities. One day, Mike Kays was standing on the porch of the Octagon Barn, and he said, "Oh, we're going to Costa Rica to map this cave that we think may be the deepest cave in the country." And I said, "I can survey. Need me?" He said, "Sure, come on along." And off we went to Puerto Rico. Chuck Hempel, Larry Fleming, Chuck didn't go in the cave, Larry Fleming and the Keys, father and son, and we pushed a cave that was really sharp Rillenkarren, tight crawlways, vertical work, and the last day we were surveying was just Ed and myself. I made it through this squeeze, Ed could not. That was the end of our survey, but it was the deepest cave in Costa Rica, and I believe it still is. We were pretty happy with what we had accomplished. Now, I'm wearing some vertical gear there, and very soon after that, we met a young man who was a Costa Rican caver, and he said, "Boy, I wish I had vertical gear. We can't do that kind of caving because I don't own any of it." I took it off and I gave it to him. 30 years later, we met that no longer young man at a bat research conference in San Jose, Costa Rica. And he came up to me and said, "Giving me that gear meant everything to me. I'm president of the Costa Rican Speleological Society, and your giving me that gear is what brought me to where I am." So, on a trip to Scott Hollow Cave in West Virginia, I was caving with friend Carl Snyder. We're on our way out of the cave. We've been in for 18 hours, and he said, "How do you feel?" And I was pretty buff at that point, and I felt really good, and I told him so. He said, "You're ready for Lechuguilla." I said, "Really? Lechuguilla?" Off I went. My first trip into Lechuguilla, I was led by Pat Sizer on a short day trip, but I went on several expeditions through the years and got to do some really interesting initial exploration in Lechuguilla. Until Lechuguilla decided to fight back. Rock dropped on my knee. We won't give the whole Lechuguilla story because I've given that before, and if you want to see it some other time, I'll do it. But what was most important to me was the camaraderie. All of a sudden, the entire expedition dropped what they were doing, came to my side, and started hauling me out. There are a lot of recognizable faces in here. We've got Pat Sizer, we've got Don Coons, Ann and Peter Bosted. There are lots of people in here that you may recognize. But that was our first night of carryout. We rested and went on. After 4.5 days since I had entered, I came out, and I had two major goals when I came out. The first one was to make sure my community was looked at in a good light. And so I did lots and lots of interviews. And the advantage was that I knew how to steer the press to the positive. And because of that, we were able to bring out of this news media pieces that talked about the friendship, the camaraderie, and the self-rescue ability of the community. My second goal was to be back in Lechuguilla 1 year later. Diana Northup was able to help me with that. She invited me on a science trip, and 1 year to the day after I broke my knee, I was back in Lechuguilla taking samples underground with Diana. So what about all the time Mike and I have spent in Hawaii in the last few years? Well, Hawaii has become our major project goal. In 2001, Don Coons invited us to join him. We didn't know the kind of car rides we'd be taking. That muffler had twisted 3 to 4 times before it broke off. We also didn't know that some of the caves were really wet, and learned about the fact that caving at lower altitude and higher altitude in Hawaii are two very, very different things. We got to join Peter Bosted on a bunch of trips. He did a lot of high altitude work, and to this day we still volunteer a couple of days at least in going on one of Peter's projects, some of them quite spectacular. One of them is currently at 90 miles of map passage, not all contiguous, but it's all on one mountainside and very exciting stuff. We had a friend, Fred Stone, who was a New York caver, did work in New York, and we spent quite a bit of time with him both in New York and Hawaii. He took us on our first hot shoe trip across the lava and how to walk on hot lava without melting the soles of your shoes. Fred was a long-time very good friend. He had a caving accident and eventually was wheelchair confined. We did a lot of work with him, with working in his gardens, and spent a great deal of time with him until he passed away about 5 years ago. The major project on the island is the Kanahina system. And I can see people in this room who own pieces of the land in the Kanahina system. It's a system that was 13 miles long when we started mapping. It's 30 miles long now, contiguous, with more than 10 miles of non-contiguous cave in addition. And we realized very early on, with Don and with several others, that some of this cave needed to be protected because it was in the middle of a subdivision. We explored it, we made sure that we knew where it was going. I was given the nickname of Emily Pop-In because people would point to cracks and say, Emily pop in here, Emily pop in there. I also was recently given by Tomislav the name of Lead Weasel because I weasel out the leads. And some of them are quite tight, and we generally go through 1 or 2 or 3 shirts every trip to Hawaii. I also have done project work in Hawaii with Diana and with several other people, Penny Boston, photographing, sampling, and lots of survey. And then some radio location with some of Brian Pease's great radio location materials. So the Cave Conservancy of Hawaii was established. It is a strong, enthusiastic, small group by the way, join us please. There's a table out in the hallway where you can learn more about it. But it's a really exciting group, people working hard to buy more land and protect it over the Conahina system and several other places on the island. We've gotten to do work with PBS, flying by helicopter out to the Great Crack for a filming. This was a lot of fun because of my theatrical background. Neither the producer nor the sound editor would go underground. So they handed me the job of continuity and sound for the trip. We've also done a lot of NCRC work on the island. OCRs, Perry and Bill Franz have flown over to help with those projects. Steve Smith, who is a doctor, made sure that we had space at the hospital to do the NCRC classes. We've trained rangers and firefighters and local cavers and visiting cavers. I look forward to my next visit to Hawaii. But here's more opportunity. We were at a bat research conference, and there was a flyer sitting out on a table. And the flyer said, bat experts needed. And I went in and said to Mike, look at this flyer. We pay our plane fare. They take care of everything for 18 days in Fiji. He said, but we do bat technician work. We're not bat experts. I said, yes. But how many of the 450 people at this conference know how to survey a cave? What's one of the projects they want to complete? They want to complete the survey of the cave. So we were chosen, and off we went to Fiji. Now, in Fiji and most of the South Pacific, they don't give you T-shirts for conferences or for meetings or for projects. They give you Sulus. So these were our expedition Sulus. And to visit the chief of the village and ask permission to do research, you have to wear the Sulu and stay below the level of the chief. You do not stand up in front of the chief. So off we went to visit with the chief. The arrangement had been made ahead of time, but this was a formality to visit him. We also had to visit with the cocoa plantation, because part of the land over the cave we were going to be surveying was owned by the local cocoa plantation. We were doing telemetry work, glued little transmitters, thank you, transmitters onto the bats. Some of them groomed them off, and we had to go wading through the bat guano piles to find the transmitters, but we did have quite a few, and we followed them each night across the area, through the mountains, to see where they were going and whether there were any other places they were going back to. What we found out was these cute little guys, don't they have a nice smile? These cute little guys, the Fijian free-tailed bat, only roost in one cave that is known anywhere in Fiji. That meant the tracking. We worked with villagers on the tracking. The tracking location told us that this cave really needed to be protected. So this is our lodging in Fiji. Now, one of the interesting things is there is a fan here, but there was no electricity. So we would go to sleep at 3 in the morning, soaking wet, take a shower, wake up at 6 o'clock, take another shower, wake up at 7:30, and it was 90 degrees, and we were done sleeping. So we mapped the cave. We taught one of the local preserve women how to use survey equipment. She'd never been in a cave. She'd never used survey equipment. And I know her light is quite close to the survey instrument, but we managed to get within 1 degree, foresight and backsight. She and I worked very, very well together. And Mike kept the book. We had a really good time doing this survey. And we had our girl power photo under the Nakanathagi sign. The village is were the people who owned most of the land over the cave. We had to go before the cocoa plantation in our Sulus and have a kava ceremony, which was negotiating for the purchase of the land by Bat Conservation International. They were able to buy it. They were able to get the land from the Fijian group, the village group of Nakanathagi. Mike did a sketch for everything, and then we handed everything over to John Dunham, who did a beautiful map for us that's being used for publicity in Fiji to this day. We had a lot of partners to work on with this project, and a really great team. And there is the dedication of the first Fijian cave bat sanctuary. So what do Thailand and Lechugia have in common? Well, the New York Times tells the story. When the Thailand rescue occurred, very early on, the New York Times published this article, 5 Successful Cave Rescues. Mike came up with this online and he said, uh-oh, our friend Larry Fleming had told us, well, you're never going to live the Lechugia rescue down. And I said, oh, it'll fade away. No, 30 years later. Now, one of the interesting things about this picture is they show this as me and Lechugia. Actually, I don't know who it is, and it's Ball's Cave in New York across the street from my house. But they did tell the story of the accident in Lechugia. And what happens is the New York Times is the newspaper that everyone looks at. And so all of these news media are looking at the New York Times, seeing this article, and the phone starts ringing off the hook. So with permission of Anmar, who was the head of NCRC at the time, and Gary, who was president of the NSS, I took some of the burden off of them and started doing TV and radio pieces on the rescue. Now, all I knew was what Anmar sent me. He'd send me these notices telling me what was going on and how they were succeeding or not succeeding. And all I did was be a talking head and smile and nod and say, if anyone can do it, the divers who are there can do it. That was pretty much all I had to say. So what about the rest of the world? Well, this opportunity thing is an obsession with me. And whenever we hear about a possibility of traveling somewhere, we take advantage of it. Early on, I took a trip with 2 friends to Australia. We had a bare boat charter. We went caving. We went to see waterfalls, and I got a taste of Australia. This was before Mike was in the picture. I, every year for probably almost 20 years, went to the British Cave Research Association meetings, made friends with British cavers. This is a guy named Tony J. Ratt. He owned Bat Products. I spent time with Chris and Judith Calford, the cave photographers in Wales. This is a Welsh Caving Club building. And I went digging. In the Mendip Hills, they love digging. And since I know about digging in the Northeast and enjoy joining in on digging projects, I would dig with Tony Jarrett every time I went over to England. Now, I can't tell you which trip this is because those 4 duffel bags have probably traveled more than many of the people in this room. We'd fill them with 1 bag of caving gear, 1 bag of personal gear, and 2 bags of Speleo books. And we would travel places, set up the business, get to go caving, get to travel, and pay for most of the trip by selling stuff. That included Slovenia, New Zealand. Oh, this is a really exciting one. This is the whale skeleton in New Zealand. This is a whole whale skeleton in a passage in New Zealand. We had friends all over the world and took time to see them. Once every 5 or 7 years, Moira wrote the book on New Zealand caving. And then we went to the Czech Republic for the International Congress. Now, I look a little starstruck there because Czech Republic vertical work is a little different than ours. Okay, we have ladders with no belays. And I mean ladders. We actually had one Brit who took one look at this and said, where are the horizontal caves? We got to cave with folks from Australia and Iran. And those ladders are tiring. I think they're more tiring than vertical work. And we got to meet people from all over the world. And again, this is where those opportunities present themselves. You shake hands with somebody at those meetings, and they will say, if you're ever in wherever, look me up. You've got my name, you've got my email, because it's in the list in the program. We would set up the business, as I said. There's Speleo books set up in the Czech Republic. And we'd have meetings with people. This is Karsten Peter. He was the National Geographic Photographer of the Year for 2 years running. We were having lunch with him because Mike was hired as his assistant for a photo shoot in China. So we became more and more interested in volcano speleology because of our trips to Hawaii. And we joined the volcano speleology group, again met people, and decided that plane fares to Iceland were really low. We contacted our friend in Iceland and said, well, can you steer us to places? He said, I can do better than that. And he took us on some hikes. The volcano was live at the time, and he took us to a place where you have 2 continental plates, and I got to stand on 2 continental plates at the same time. We went caving, and when we came back from a loop around the island, our friend said, what did you think? Well, I've had a lot of experience managing caves for the NSS and the Northeastern Cave Conservancy, and I said, do you really want to know what we think? And our friend said, yes. I said, I think that Iceland is going to lose most of its most beautiful sites are going to be pretty severely destroyed in the next 20 years because none of them are managed. People go to them, there's no management, there's no rangers, there are no toilets, there are no pathways, there's erosion issues, and he said, do you want to go on TV? Well, my answer is always, I've been on TV lots of times, I don't need to go on TV. He said, will you go on TV? And I said, for you, absolutely. So he set up an interview, which ended up being the lead story on the Sunday night news, with a reporter who was very concerned about the environment in Iceland. And I ended up having an interview talking about what countries are doing a good job of managing their resources and the fact that Iceland needs to pay attention. Last year, Iceland had 350,000 inhabitants and 2.5 million visitors. So they really need to do something. I started a national dialogue. There were TV interviews the rest of the week having to do with this subject, and apparently there has continued to be some dialogue. Mike and I went to the hot tub that night, hold this picture for a second. We went to the hot tub, a guy looked at me and said, you were on TV tonight. And I said, oh my God, is this somebody in the tourist trade? And he said, no, you're so right, we need to protect our resources. So the people are ripe for taking care of their property. We decided to go to the next volcano speleology meeting, which was recently in the Galapagos, and if you went the week early, you had to do project work, which didn't bother us at all because we love doing project work. We ran into Norm and Martha Thompson. They needed photo assistance, and so off we went to do stereo photography underground with Norm. It was great fun. And that one's not stereo, but that's one of Norm's photos. It was a very interesting passage. What we also found out was that probably there are thousands of caves in the Galapagos that have not been discovered or mapped. because it's so hard to get to certain areas that no one has ever surveyed them, and there's no LiDAR to look at. So even away from the caves, I'm interested in caves. Because of my background in creative and performing arts, I've spent quite a bit of time dealing with music, art, and theater. I've received 2 Flowstone Record Awards. I've inspired authors. The idea for this book was mine. Michael Ray Taylor thanks me in the back of it. And one year in '91, we decided that Ed Zalaki was at the convention helping out. He had lived in Tokyo, and he brought a pile of printouts that he had having to do with book lists. And he said, I want to do a bibliography of speleology. Diana Northup was a librarian. We invited her to come meet with us. He met with several other people, George Hubbard, several others, and we decided we were going to work as a team on a bibliography of speleology. Ed died suddenly 2 weeks later and left this in Diana's and my lap. It took us 7 years to complete this book. We went to other countries to visit people's libraries, we took notes, and we annotated over a quarter of the books. I also started quilting because Barb asked me to join her at an OTR trip, and I met with the OTR quilters, and I started quilting and fell in love with quilting. This is a quilt taken from a picture that was taken of Mike on the China caving trip. And one of the things that really interests me is doing a wide range of styles of quilting. So I try and go out there, find different ideas, and create a wide range. I do some commission work. I did 2 of these quilts for Bill when Bob died because he wanted every single t-shirt that had been sold at OTR in a quilt. And he wanted one for himself and one to give to the NSS. Gordon Smith encouraged me to do more quilts that were really cavey. So Mike and I went through hundreds of NSS news covers and found silhouettes that would work on a quilt. Photocopied them, cut them out, and I did this quilt, which Gordon bought from me and is now in the possession of the Cave and Karst Museum. Now, during all this, I always wanted to give back. I started way back in '73 when the ladder into Knox Cave was an old boat rope. And the fire company had said they were going to blow the cave shut because they had to do so many rescues of people who couldn't climb out of the boat rope. So off we went with these steel beams tied to the roof of the Franklin Pierce College Outing Club van. Thank goodness they never looked on the roof when I returned it. At one point, the Schoharie cabin burned down, and Bob Addis and a group of people from the Helderberg Hudson Grotto decided to rebuild on the same spot. My job was to go over there twice a day, carry buckets of water up, and pour it on the concrete so it could cure. I've helped with auctions at NROs, and I've developed a relationship with the Department of Conservation in New York State starting in '83 when we did a survey of McPhail's caves bats and have been working with them ever since. This is the current group of DEC bat specialists, all women, great group, and I still go with them caving to help make sure that their safety is of the utmost. I've worked with youth groups and taking them into easy caves like Clarksville, which is the Northeastern Cave Conservancy penultimate beginner cave, and food. Somewhere along the line, I learned how to cook for enormous numbers of people, and I'm not sure where or when it happened. But all of a sudden, I found myself being the coordinator of NRO dinners year after year after year. Also helped with cave cleanups, gate building with cave gators and Crash Kennedy. This is up in the Adirondacks. Don't tell me when you're in your 70s you can't carry steel beams up a mountain, because I did. And worked on a new ladder for Ball's Cave a few years ago. It really needs to be replaced every 20 years. It had been 30 and the top broke off. We needed to replace it right away. I work with bat groups in Vermont and New York. This is at Aeolus Cave in Vermont, where we were tagging bats. I handled 500 bats that night. And I've worked on preserves. I have been a preserve manager for the Northeastern Cave Conservancy, for 2 caves, for Benson's Cave, for McPhail's, for Schoharie, for Knox, for Ball's Cave, and some of them several times. Whenever there was nobody who wanted to do it, I'd step in and do it just to cover it for a few years. And the latest project was clearing the land and putting up a wonderful new cabin on the Gage Cave property for the NSS. We had an amazing team. I think we had close to 100 people that volunteered at one time or another, and it was a great group, and I fed them. That's homemade pizza. None of this store-bought stuff. And it's turned out beautifully, and I hope some of you will be able to stay there at pre or post camps next year. The dedication party I cooked for, and the neighbors came. I'm always conscious of community, not just caving community, but my community around me. That includes wildflower walks for the adult education group, and we had a major issue in 2011 with Hurricane Irene. And what happened was an amazing storm which brought 8 feet of water to the main street of my village. There are only 310 buildings in the village. 275 of them had to be gutted from the first floor down. It was a frightening situation. Mike and I came back from OTR. This happened on August 28th. We came back from OTR and said to our neighbor who was leading the charge to rebuild the village, "What can we do?" And she said, "Feed people." So we established the Loaves and Fishes Cafe and started feeding people. We made sure there were hot meals every day. Even in the beginning when we didn't have electricity, we had grills. We fed people every day at noon, sandwiches, hot choices, soups. People came and we welcomed them as our guests. And in that first year, we fed 20,000 meals. The second year, we only were open 2 days a week because a lot of people had kitchens, were able to get home. We still did it for volunteers. We fed another 5,000 meals. And like anything in the caving community, my community was a group of people who were willing to step up and give their time. And these were what we called the bread pudding queens, because we would often have bread pudding every single day, almost every day. And there were people who came in and said, "The bread pudding is making us keep our house and stay in the village." We were asked, "Well, how did you learn how to do this? I mean, did you own a restaurant?" And I said, "No, incident command. I learned incident command in NCRC, and that taught me how to feed people over a long period of time." So what's the next project? I'm here to invite you to the convention of a lifetime for lifetime cavers like me and you, young people who are going to become lifetime cavers. We want you to come to New York, see the NSS properties, and join us. We're very excited about this project. Ken and Mike are our team leaders. We have an amazing team of people some new cavers, some longtime cavers, but the enthusiasm is absolutely wonderful. Now, I can't leave you without remembering, and this is going to be hard for me, remembering people who I love, who we've lost, who helped bring me to where I am today. Andy Kaminsky, the Mad Russian, Peter's father-in-law. Russ and Jean Gurney. My buddy Ed Zalaki. Larry Fleming. Bob Liebman. Avis Van Swearingen. Fred Stone. And Karen Casting. I miss these people every day. Thank you very much. I will entertain questions except for the weight of the rock that hit my knee. Yes?
Emily, what are one or two of the best changes you've seen in caving in the NSS in the last 50 years? And what are one or two of the worst or least desirable changes you've seen?
I think the two best changes for me, Louise wanted to know what she thinks are the best things that have happened in the NSS or in caving in the last X number of years, and what are negatives. I think the best are the number of women I see in the caving community. It's become comfortable for women to be on expedition, to lead groups, and I think it's very important. I never had a problem with that, but I was lucky. And I had some people who supported me. The other positive is I'm now seeing over the last few years a large number of people under the age of 30 attending events and conventions. Excuse me. And I think that as I stand up here as an old coot at my 50th NSS convention, seeing the young people makes me so excited. Negatives, the number of people who belong to the NSS. At one point we were up to 12 or 13,000. We've dropped. I really want to see the enthusiasm and the young people come back into the fold and bring as many of their friends with them. That's a negative to me. I think the other thing is the number of grottos volunteering to hold a convention. We used to be 3 to 4 years out. We need to realize that, yes, it's a hard job. Yes, there'll be people complaining. Yes, you may have problems, but this is our family, and we need to have our family reunion every year. And people have to volunteer to do that. Right now, we're 3 years out. We've got New York, we've got Indiana, and we've got Texas. We really need to be 4 years out. It gets harder to find places to do this, so that's my other negative. Any other questions? Yes, in the back.
So I'm actually going to be bringing a bunch of newbie cavers, friends of mine, to next year's New York convention, but also look at some cave areas before that convention. What areas would you suggest for newer cavers in the New York area?
What caves would I suggest for new cavers in the New York area? I believe that there will be pre-camps right in the area around the NSS caves. Many of those and many of the NCC caves are great beginner or early caves. I'm hoping that maybe some people in Pennsylvania might offer a pre-camp for people driving up from there. We haven't really set the pre-camps yet. We're hoping for one in Vermont, though a lot of that is vertical. But there are a lot of of very good, easy caves in the New York area, and we're hoping that we'll have trips led for that. Our trip coordinator is excellent, Eric Neiman, and we're hoping that some other groups and grottos will try and step in.
Thank you.
There'll be more on that later. Thank you very much.